You're listening to Thanks for Making It, a podcast about exceptional creations and collaborations by artists, designers, scientists, and engineers who make things that feel magical.
Hey.
Hey.
It's so great to have you join us on the show, Kyle Doerksen. We've known each other for a while, actually. I'm trying to think when we first met at the is it called DLD? That conference?
Yeah, I think it was DLD
Yeah.
in New York.
DLD in New York, and I remember you had the Onewheel outside, and I think honestly I was like a little bored at the conference, and I saw the Onewheel, and I was like, "What is that magical thing? I need to learn more." And then you let me ride it, and I don't know, I feel like we became like instant friends.
Totally.
And
Yeah,
that
that was awesome. You know, we talk about destroying boredom, so it's perfect application. And it was good that
Totally.
we got to ride then too, because that was the early days when one wheels are hard to come by, and I ended up selling that one that I had there to some Russians who were there for the conference. They're like, "We want to buy this one right now in cash." It was like, okay.
Okay, all right.
I had to walk back to my hotel.
Yeah, what was that? Would that have been 2014, 2013?
Like maybe 2015 or so around then.
15? All right. Cool. Well, that was really exciting. And then you've come and you've been a guest in my class a couple of times while I was at Harvard. And hopefully we'll come to Brown and RISD now that I'm there. But anyway, it's been wonderful to get to know you as a person, and I continue to be a huge fan of the Onewheel as a product. And so, I don't know, maybe in your words, do you want to tell us a little
Thanks.
bit more about what the Onewheel is?
Yeah, so Onewheel is a product that has one giant wheel with a motor in it and sensors that control the motion of the motor to balance you. So it essentially balances for you, and you lean forward to go, you lean back to slow down, and you lean on your heel or toe side to make turns. Yeah, that's sort of the technical description. I think, it emotionally, it's like the feeling of snowboarding on powder, and which is really what I was trying to create from the beginning.
So you are now the head of this company. You have multiple products. You're the founder of the company and continue to run it. You have multiple Onewheel products. Can you tell us more about what those are?
Yeah. So, we started with a single product, which I think was an interesting design and engineering challenge. It's kind of like, I think about the expression about the Ford Model T, any color you want as long as it's black. And we had one product in one color, and, that was kind of all we could do as a small company. Subsequently, first of all, we made our product line go faster and farther, and the kind of things that the core users were asking for. And then in 2019, we also came out kind of based on insights about our future customer base, right? That was like, hey, maybe there should be a smaller, lighter, less expensive model, and that'd be good for people that are just starting out, or they want to use it for transportation, or especially, women could appreciate the lighter weight, and, kids and stuff like that as well. And all of us, frankly, can appreciate the lighter weight. So we came out with
Right.
Pint at that point. And then in late October of last year, we came out with the Pint X, which is still small, but goes now about 15 miles on a charge. And in
Nice.
GT, which is our flagship. It's the most powerful. It's about 3 horsepower. It goes 20 miles an hour. It goes 32 miles on a charge. And, it's really a board sport. So there's this element of progression, right? People want to go ride more advanced terrain and features and go farther and do things that, we never would have imagined in the early days. But they see someone do it and they're like, oh, I can do that and even better. And then they go challenge themselves. And, I think that's been an interesting part of what we've created.
I remember visiting your offices in Santa Cruz and seeing the first prototype. Could you take us to the story of sort of not just where the product was, but where you were in your life at the moment of creating this initial prototype that's basically, wood and chain. And we
hmm
can hopefully put a picture of that up. But I just want to get to know Kyle in that moment.
Yeah, so my education was in engineering. Yeah, I studied neuroengineering as an undergrad, and then realized nobody would hire me with that degree back in that era. So I did a master's in mechanical engineering because I figured I could always get a job with that diploma, and then ended up working at IDEO, doing product design consulting for about 8 years.
Hmm.
And, really was just developing products for clients, every day, day
Hmm.
and night, working across a bunch of different sectors. I was working on kids' toys, I was working on furniture, I was working on consumer electronics, medical products. And it's really interesting cross pollination between, design trends, new technologies, market sectors, business needs, and, trying to put that all together in a creative way. And it's sort of the ultimate playground and the ultimate, place to learn that design process, really a
Yeah.
special experience to work with that many designers. I think IDEO was about
Yeah.
500 people at that point, most of them designers. And so
Yeah.
it's pretty rare. Often designers are
Yeah.
like the only designer in their organization or
Right.
something like
Or
that. And
maybe there's a couple. Yeah,
I don't
totally.
think I appreciated at the time that, to really have like hundreds of designers working shoulder
Yeah.
to shoulder, teaching each other new tools and ideas. And, it's a special place to start my career.
Absolutely. And for people listening, if you're not familiar with IDEO, they're probably the most famous design consulting company today, product design consulting. And they don't offer a direct to consumer product. So not everybody has heard of them that, doesn't already work in an adjacent field.
Yeah, and IDEO really started at the intersection of mechanical engineering and industrial design. And
Hmm.
as I mentioned, my background's in mechanical engineering. Then over time, it sort of evolved and shifted sort of towards more strategic projects, brand strategy, interaction design, campaigns and things like that.
Hmm.
And for me, I always have the urge to tinker and build, and so especially when I was staffed on some of the more brand focused projects, I'd be like, oh, I need to get to the workshop and I need to build something. And so
Yeah.
the Onewheel, what became Onewheel was a side project originally. And it was inspired by a couple things. One, I grew up in Western Canada and loved snowboarding on powder, particularly. And I'm
Hmm.
sort of a powder hound. Like I could really care less about going to the mountains if it's not snowing. I love that just soft floating feeling. And then the IDEO had a few offices, one of which is in San Francisco. So it's about a 40-minute train ride for me and then a 15-minute walk, except I was always running late. And so I was always thinking, wow, I wish I had a little gadget I could take with me on the train, so
Yeah.
I'd be there on time for my meeting. And so those two daydreams of how can I feel like I'm snowboarding a powder and, how can I get where I want to go kind of intersected with work I'd been doing on some of the first motion controlled kids toys. So if you flash
Hmm.
back to, the Nintendo Wii was one of the first consumer products that incorporated accelerometer and gyro
Hmm.
sensors. And then a couple years later, the iPhone. And they took
Hmm.
what was a fairly esoteric motion sensing technology and really, drove the cost down to, sub $1 for that, type of tech. And I realized that, that could let us do some pretty interesting things. Yeah,
Hmm.
and, I was really thinking about a vehicle from the perspective of like, what is the minimum vehicle that can exist?
Hmm.
How do you take stuff away?
Hmm.
Bicycle is pretty minimal, but that's two wheels. Can you take one of them away? It has
Yeah.
steering. Can you take that away? It has this frame that sort of defines how big it needs to be. Can you take that away or reduce it? And kind of came down to, a single wheel, form factor that then, as you're mentioning, I worked in the workshop cutting pieces of aluminum and had a big motor and an Arduino in there with some early, algorithms that I'd written that, were not really anything like that the product is today now that we have
Hmm.
professionals on the case. But
Yeah.
It demonstrated the basic experience. And I think to me, the most interesting products to design are ones where it is really all about the experience. And
Hmm.
I think that's true for most products, but to me is like, for the initial Onewheel prototypes, it didn't really matter what it looked like. It
Yeah.
was really about, what is the experience of riding it? And if that
Hmm.
was compelling, you could always, make it more refined and so on. But the core of those early explorations were all the experience. What does this feel like? Is it compelling? What would make it better?
Hmm.
And doing a lot of experimentation in those early days. The very first ones actually did not have a control system to control your balance. And that made it
Really?
impossible to ride. So then I realized that, okay, you're going to need some help here. And,
That's funny.
narrower tires and wider
Hmm.
tires and a lot of kind of searching for the Goldilocks, solution, too narrow a tire, it's too tippy, too wide,
Yeah.
it's hard to turn. But the just right tire, is both stable and provides great cornering.
Hmm.
And just kind of dialing in and chasing this ride experience that I had in my mind from snowboarding that I wanted to create in riding the Onewheel.
Yeah. I mean, one thing, there's so many things that I love about this product. Like it is really beautiful and the evolution of it, both, technologically and, kind of from a visceral or identity perspective has evolved. They're all elements of this are beautiful in that way. But the thing that I love so much about it, even more than like the quality of the design of the product itself, is that the experience is the motion, right? It's the feeling and of a certain motion and the emotion that that motion generates for a person. And like as a design brief, it would be so hard to deliver that. If somebody said, "Okay, here's your challenge. I want you to create the floaty feeling of um of snowboarding on powder, what as a talented snowboarder, right? Not as a first timer."
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting, right, is, you think about design and you often think about industrial design and graphic design. And, it's pretty easy to go look at like mood boards and inspirations and award winning
Hmm.
designs for what
Yeah,
they look like, right? But then you think about designing a product at the core of what it is what it feels like. And that's really hard to
exactly.
put on a
Yeah.
mood board, you know?
Totally.
And
Yeah, I don't even know how you would do it.
yeah, you don't, and I never took any classes in how to design motion, or how to
Yeah.
design, carvability, but
Mhm.
yet I, obviously have an idea of what the North Star is that we were chasing. And I think, obviously in areas like automotive, right, they're often designing the sound of the door when it closes and
Mhm.
like the feeling of the way the vehicle corners and things like that, the acceleration profile so that it feels sporty or it feels safe or whatever they're trying to achieve. And a lot of these sort of borderline intangible, things that are hard to describe, but really are the intersection of engineering and
Yeah.
design because there's a lot of different, ways you could engineer it.
Mhm.
And to me, design is looking at all those engineering, approaches and basically deciding which you're going to take.
Mhm.
And the engineering is more quantitative, right? But the design is more subjective, to
Right.
really define what a product's going to be, what those feel factors are going to be. That's to me like the core of what design is, right? It's taste and judgment, applied to a
Mhm.
landscape of alternatives.
Yeah, and I wonder, so you mentioned I'd like to learn more about your background and like how you sounds like you had to fall in love with a few different things that ultimately kind of came together in your mind to create this side project that of course became, a product and then a company that you continue to run, you know, what is it? When did you fund? Is it about a decade ago?
Started in 2013. Yeah, so we're nine years in now.
2013. Exactly. So Yeah, it's become, an enormous part of your life. And it feels like you had to fall in love with snowboarding. You had to fall in love with mechanical engineering. You had to fall in love with design in different ways that this would not have otherwise happened. So I'd love to hear more about, where you were born and kind of some key moments along the way that led you to have this mind that could kind of come up with this integrated product.
Yeah. So if you go all the way back to the beginning and being, a kid, my dad was a carpenter and a builder. So there were always tools around our house, and I would borrow them and usually lose them or use them incorrectly. And, that sometimes
Did
had
he get mad?
consequences.
My dad would get so
Yeah,
bad.
there were often consequences. But
Did he
yeah,
label them? Did he get the label gun out?
no, I don't think they were
Yeah, he wasn't
labeled.
that kind
No, but they were obviously
Yeah.
his. But that kind of feeling that you can shape the world around you. I think like a lot of people never have that. But people that are like literally building houses and kitchens and whatever for folks, they get to experience that every day. And it's sort of reminiscent of that Steve Jobs quote that one day you realize that everything around you was built by people just like you, right?
Yeah.
And
Totally.
And
And what age are you about this time when you're thinking about this memory?
when I was losing my dad's tools, I was probably, I don't know, 6 or 7 years old.
Yeah, something like that. Okay, gotcha.
Of course, like most kids, right? You learn how to ride a bike, ride a scooter, whatever. You zoom around, and for many of us, those are like some of our most fun childhood memories. And I think that's been an interesting part of bringing Onewheel to the world is that people get to kind of flash back to that same mode of like learning how to ride a bike, right? Like the first time you try to ride a bike, you're like, I'm never going to be able to do this. And then, you try it a few times and eventually it
Yeah.
clicks and you're like, wow. And like they say, you never forget how to ride a bike. And Onewheel has a little bit of a similar, short learning curve, but it's still a couple minutes where at first you're like, there's no way this is going to work. And then it
Yeah.
like starts working and you can do it and you're tentatively riding. And then, you get a little more confident on it and then you're like having the time of your life, so
Yeah.
bringing back that kind of, childlike joy, are some of the most fun moments of what we get to do. But yeah, then I got into, I was a nerd, I was always into science and robotics and all that kind of stuff and programming. Like I learned how to write code as, I don't know, elementary school student, I guess. And, get kept with that, doing projects and different things. And, then when I went to college, I was really interested in neuroscience and the brain. And particularly a few things. I mean, one was artificial neural networks, which, now mainly called machine learning and AI, right? But I kind of had an early look at how, this is going to be a really amazing technology, computing that was inspired by the brain. But I was also interested in the flip side of that, which was how do you use computers to study the human brain? And so I got the opportunity to work with some really amazing scientists that were working in that space, as an undergrad researcher. Mainly, I was interested in perception, so how our senses work and relay information to the brain, and then what the brain does with that, right? And I mentioned that because, Onewheel, the core of it are these sensors, right, that then need to feed into quote unquote the brain, right, the controller of the Onewheel. It needs to interpret those signals. It needs to filter them. It needs to decide what's important, what's not important. Needs to integrate them, and then it needs to make some decisions about how it's then going to control the motor in order to keep it balanced. And that kind of, like feedback system, smart system is something that I think is really interesting. And that like the control techniques that are in Onewheel are really things that were developed for the aerospace industry back in the early days of electronic controls, going back to, basically like the 1940s and 50s, where suddenly these jet aircraft, military aircraft, were very fast, and they had stability issues because they needed to have really teeny wings in order to fly through the sound barrier. And the really teeny wings meant that unlike, the longer, straighter, wider wings of previous aircraft that provided some inherent stability, now you needed, control system augmentation to maintain stability in aircraft. And so like, I always thought that was a really cool technology, but was kind of bummed that it was only really applied for, killing people and tools of war. Right. And I was like, how can you, sort of take this like swords into plowshares kind of thing where you can use, these technologies and techniques to build something that like enhances the human condition instead of, threatening it. And so my interest in aviation along the way, kind of was another influence. And if you look at kind of the design and the positioning of especially the first gen Onewheel product is very, aesthetically, to me, the inspirations were aerospace, skateboarding and auto racing, which to me are all these like Southern California influences, right? And putting those together into something that feels like a sport. Maybe it's a motorsport, maybe it's a gravity sport. It's unclear, but it definitely feels sporty. And not like not really like a gadget, that's all plasticky and, smooth and techy, but something that's a little bit raw. And a little bit, I mean, especially if you look at the first generation Onewheels, like it's a little unclear what era they were built in. Like they might have been built in the 60s, might have been the 2010s, might be 2030, it's sort of unclear. And that was intentional.
Yeah, when we used to ride them around in, my husband and I used to ride them around in Harvard Square. And I lived out there, and a lot of people would ask us if we made them ourselves because they had this kind of robust, like you say, nothing plasticky. This was an early version.
Yeah, I mean, it's like straight lines, kind of just minimal, right? Like if you can use a straight line, use a straight line, if you can use a flat surface, use a flat surface. And, we also had wood in the, foot pads, which to me was sort of an homage to obviously skateboarding with skate decks laminated from maple ply. But also just the humanizing element, right? It is technology, but it's technology for people, and the organic element kind of, I thought underscored that and connected that with people.
Yeah, I love those design decisions, and they continue to be reflected in the product and today.
Yeah, and I think too, I mean, especially if you think about designing like first generation products, you need to have some elements that make them relatable to people, because people are really trying to figure out like, what is this thing? What world does it live in? Is this for me? And so that's where, we consciously wanted to be a bit more literal and more closely connected to those worlds of skate and aviation and motorsports. And then over time, we can kind of define our own lane and do things our own way. But, that was, I think, important in the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, some elements of this conversation remind me of going to the Vespa Museum in Italy, and you see, here's another personal mobility vehicle that was radically innovative for its time. And a lot of their design references are also from aviation. And it's an interesting coincidence, but the way you describe it reminds me of that.
Yeah, it was funny to me, when I was in college and doing my master's, I had like no interest really in vehicles. And it's funny because a lot of mechanical engineers go on to work in vehicle industry. And to me, it just like, I wanted to create like smaller and more personal products versus essentially cars, which is what vehicles meant at that point. And then it's interesting to kind of focus more on this, human and personal products. And that was mainly what I worked on at IDEO. And then to basically like combine that with this sort of, interest in motion and moving. And then to do that in a moment where, electric vehicles were just kind of coming into the mainstream, right? 20,
Totally.
13 is when I founded this company. 2014, we launched the first gen. And you go back to that era, right? I mean, Tesla was shipping the Roadster, I think. And everybody was like,
Hmm.
yeah, that's not going to be a thing. Electric cars are going to die out as they,
Yeah.
as they did before. And, this is, not really going to gain any traction. Of course, all those people were wrong. And I
Yeah.
could see that coming, right? I could see that the technology is now at a point where this time it was going to be different. The first
Hmm.
one-wheel prototypes I built, they had lead acid batteries, which meant they were really heavy, and it's just
Yeah.
can't really create something that's elegant and powerful. But with the lithium batteries that came onto the scene in the early 2010s, essentially, that had a high enough power density to build vehicles, now you could build an electric car. You could actually pack enough power into a 20-pound one wheel that it can, take you, 20 miles an hour. That
Yeah.
just wasn't possible until the technology got to a certain point. And so I think to me, it's always been about, looking at different technologies and things that are out there, and how do you put them together in a new way? And how do you forecast like ways in which they're getting better over a timeline that, is relevant to your, the problem that you're trying to solve.
Totally. And I wonder, I mean, because there's something about being in the right place at the right time and with the right knowledge to be able to recognize that things are different this time. And I wonder what you think that thing might be today. Our audience for this show is a lot of young people who are figuring out what they want to do next, or people changing careers at any age, and leaders of companies that want to get better at integrating design and engineering in their own creations. I just wonder what you think that thing is that has everybody says, VR, for example, is about to be different, and then it so far hasn't, fully become that thing people have been waiting for. Do you have a sense of what might be different this
Yeah,
time?
I mean, that's a great question. I think, I don't claim to be an expert in VR, but if I make the analogy to kind of stuff that we're working on, I think
Hmm.
sometimes people get caught in the trap of universal design, which is a
Hmm.
beautiful concept, but at the same time, in certain categories, it's less relevant, I would say. Like in transportation, people ask me like, is there going to be an iPhone of personal mobility?
Hmm.
And when they say that, they mean one single thing that
Yeah.
everyone has. And in my view, that answer for mobility is no, because there's just too many different needs. Like if you need to go by yourself versus you need to go with your kids, if you need to carry cargo versus you don't, if you need to go
Hmm.
1 mile versus 100 or 1,000 miles, like they all demand different solutions. And then even within like, okay, it's one person and it's 3 miles, there's a lot of different ways that could, you could solve that problem. And, when we developed Onewheel, like I didn't say every single person that needs to go 3 miles should use this. I said, if you're the kind of person that likes having fun, you like adventure, you want wind in your hair, then you should try this. And recognizing that that's not everybody. And I
Yeah.
think one of the amazing things about living in this period of time is that you can build products that are not for everyone and still scale them into large businesses because direct to consumer, you can sell things over the internet. You don't
Hmm.
just need to convince that one, buyer at Sears. And then if you do, you'll win. If you don't, you'll lose. Now,
Yeah.
it really is each individual customer can like vote with their wallet, whether they, want to be part of, the product that we created. And so taking that over to VR, right? It's like a lot of the questions are like, really about the sort of universal, like, will everyone use VR? And, if
Hmm.
I was trying to build a business in VR or AR, I would be looking more at like a use case, like
Yeah.
what is one use case that is really valuable to that user?
Hmm.
And, can I build a business there? Because if you can do that, that is ultimately what bubbles up to, wow, it's essential for this person. This person uses it for work because you made a work application, and then they also end up using it a little bit for fun, and then they use it for socializing. And there's like some beachhead where it enters into people's lives, and then they get more comfortable with it, and then they can use it across like more areas of their life. I think obviously my world is really mobility, and I think there are tremendous new and untapped opportunities in mobility because of several factors coming together. I mean, one is we're in a once in a generation shift in the energy source that we use for transportation, which is predominantly to electric. I mean, there are some other things that are useful for aviation and whatnot, but basically, until now, it was you either use internal combustion gas engines or use human power. And like, that was it. That's how you move people and, goods. And now, like, basically you're going to use electric. And the form factors that you can create using electric propulsion, maybe using dynamic stability, like using Onewheel, like they can just fundamentally be different than what the human powered or gas powered products, had to be, right? A gas engine is heavy. And so you need to build a fairly robust vehicle.
Yeah.
You need to build a motorcycle. Most motorcycles are, at least 200-300 pounds minimum, up to 1,000 pounds, right? Build a car, obviously, a couple of tons, right? But with electric, you can build, vehicles of any scale, right? Down to one wheel or even smaller, up to, a heavy, semi truck or even larger. But it's not just about like electrifying existing form factors. It's about thinking about like what new form factors could exist with this new technology that doesn't have the constraints that of the past, and I helped start an electric bicycle company along the way as well. And I thought that was, that was cool, but I was kind of frustrated that we weren't taking it farther. I'm like, why are we taking this form factor that's, 130 years old, that's basically defined by where you need to sit in order for your legs to be able to generate maximum power? If now, you're sharing that with an electric motor, and, there's just like a way more open design space that people have, barely begun to explore, I mean, even take electric cars, they basically look like gas cars at this point. And, I'm optimistic that, 10 or 20 years from now, they're going to look totally different because they should look totally different. The constraints are totally different. So, I think there's a lot of opportunity.
I was just having this conversation about the DeLorean. Did you see that come out?
Yeah.
Yeah. And like, it feels like it should have gone further, in terms of the design.
Yeah. I think, obviously retro, I think in transportation, retro is always, you can always reach for retro, right? There are people that are nostalgic. There are people that, they had the Mustang when they were 18 and now they're 50 and they want a thing that looks the same, but, so nostalgia is safe, right? Same as like remaking, the sequel to a movie is safe, but I think like the more exciting opportunity is to try something totally new. And that's what we've been doing.
Yeah. And I like how, even the way that you answered this last question, how you're thinking about it is similar to how you even set up, your description of how you came up with the Onewheel in the first place. There was this sort of breakthrough technology that was being used for things like the iPhone. And you were thinking about, well, what else could that be used in? And now that the price point has changed really dramatically. I love that way of thinking, and you can apply it in a lot of different fields. I wonder how you've been in design for much of your professional career. I wonder how you think about, what is the difference between good and great design? How can you tell?
I think
for yourself.
That's a great question, right? Everyone has their own perspective. But I think that to me, a lot of it comes down to elegance. And a lot of people in the, sort of industrial design world have that same concept, which is that, if there's, 100 lines you could use to connect two dots, what's the most elegant one, right? And I think that's like what, I feel like I'm often chasing and what, I appreciate in other designs. And that can lead you to minimalism, that can lead to sort of essential design versus more ornamental, and I think that's particularly relevant to product design. I think there are ways in which more ornamental design is, I would say, relevant in things like architecture, where, minimalism brings us certain psychological comfort. Maximalism also brings us psychological comfort. And the
Yeah.
question is where to apply, those different tools. But yeah, I think that, like design is meant to be humanizing, right? It's like, in my world, it's really like engineering and design. And the engineering, like, I think when you start your career, you look at an engineering problem, you're like, I don't know if there's any solutions. And then as you get farther along in your career, you're like, there are at least 1,000 solutions. The question is, which one,
Right.
which one is right? And you get
Right.
this just much broader view of like, okay, not only does it work, which is the engineering question, but like, is it reliable over the long term? Is it, is it cost effective
Yeah.
to build? Is it maintainable? Is it beautiful? Does, how, does it do it the way that my competitor does it, or does it do it in a fresh and interesting way that's ownable, to the brand that I'm trying to build? All these questions that when you're, 1 year out of school, you're like, I just want to try to solve this problem. Like, I don't even know if I can.
I just want to
right?
make
I mean,
it function. Yeah.
I went through that. I remember like
Yeah.
the senior engineer yelling at me being like, solve this problem. And I'm like, I don't know how, but,
Yeah.
over time you can start to realize that like, yeah, the problem isn't that there aren't enough solutions. The problem is that there's too many solutions.
Yeah.
And then you need to decide like what your sort of personal criteria that you're going to apply to select what you should move forward with.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
when you look at,
That makes sense.
for the most part, I would have to say that when you look at most great designs, it's because they winnowed down from a lot of options into down selecting to something that really worked. And, you look at like Johnny Ive at Apple, like people I know who worked with him are like, guy would make a zillion models of like every single thing. Like, oh, the power button for the iPhone. And they probably made
Right.
thousands and more, models to get it like just right. And it's not like they just, sat down and drew it and they're like, this is it. This is the design. It's like, it is refined.
Yeah.
I remember talking to a friend of mine that designs motorcycles, and he was saying, you can always tell when a motorcycle was purely designed on computer or when it was sculpted in clay and built in the workshop, because there's just a human touch that you can just feel when you look at design. I think that's, that's true for a lot of, physical product design, right? It's, you need to build it, you need to hold it, you need to realize that edge is too rough and you need to slightly smooth it. And I think that's where a lot of, designs move from being good to great, are those little refinements that humanize and simplify and,
just like this, a
make it
deep
just so.
attention to detail and the craft of whatever the thing is. Craft is kind of like an old-fashioned word in a lot of ways, but I think it might be appropriate to what you're describing.
Yeah, and behind, I think behind, people that are good at craft is generally like experience. I mean, even if they're young, it's that they went and just like, sat in their basement, like, sanding and filing and, or working on their art. Right. And I think that's where, a lot of the innovation comes from. It's just people that, are deep into, however it's made, whether that's,
Hmm.
pixels on the screen or, carving a block of wood or,
Totally.
what have you. Yeah. It comes from just working with material until you
Yeah.
get like a inherent sense of how it works. Right. And then your intuition becomes a lot better. Like then,
Yeah.
your first pass will be probably a lot closer to the final because you like deeply understood the medium that you're working in, but you still need to do refinement.
Yeah. I mean, as I understand, Apple has like an entire color team and has like an entire materials teams that just focus on that specific element. And it's sort of hard to imagine for a lot of people what a color team would do, right? But it's the dedication to just like fully focusing on building out all of those options and then narrowing them down to, what we ultimately end up seeing as consumers.
Yeah, I mean, color is interesting. I don't claim to be a color expert, but I've got a chance to work with some over the years. And
Hmm.
color is in product design is the intersection of a few different things. One is technology, like what colors can you create, and often color isn't just the color. It's not just the hue, but it's how does color work with light, and is it
Yeah.
is it a candy color? Is it a metallic color? Is it a very matte color? The same hue can behave very
Hmm.
differently. So there's that technology of like, oh, is it paint? Is it, is it integral to the material, etc. But then there's also the like what the cool color is a socially determined
Hmm.
factor. So color teams around the world, whether they're working in fashion or on smartphones or on vehicles, are actually defining the colors that we're going to like, a couple seasons from now, right? And so they are the tastemakers, and they're in general interconnected across industries. That we're sort of surprised that like, oh, the jackets this season are the same color as like the cool
Yeah.
bicycle that came out, but you shouldn't really be surprised because they're color trends are created
Mm.
by the design industry kind of working together, working with the contours of or the pendulum sort of swinging back and forth, the bold colors, the more muted colors, right? And it's going to come back at some point. So I think that's like a very interesting space of design and trend
Yeah.
work, for sure.
Yeah. And then you also have like the color in the context of use, right? So like if the product tends to always be used in a dark environment, right? Like um versus a light environment, that affects the perception of color.
Yeah,
Um
and you might have your favorite colors, but your favorite color might look terrible on something as big as a car. It
yeah,
might
yeah.
it may be
Totally.
great
Right.
as a
Like
little pop
right.
color here and there, but
Exactly.
yeah. So, there's very different uses, based on what you're designing for.
One of the things I like to ask everybody is about a favorite example of great design that is something that somebody else made. And I like to frame it as something that is just so well designed that it almost feels magical. Does something come to mind for you?
I have this, object that is sitting in my living room that comes to mind, and I'm not sure if it's magical, but it is a really good design, I think. And it's it's the IKEA chair called the Poang. You know this one? It's made with
Hmm.
bent wood on the sides.
Yeah.
And I think I got my first one when I was in college and had it in my dorm room, and I've had a few over the years, but I think it's this pretty amazing example of design that's both human, it's industrial. Um, the bent wood is flexible, right? So it
Hmm.
creates like a recliner, rocking chair with no moving pieces, right?
Yeah.
It's remarkably economical. I think they're still like $89,
Yeah, it's
compared with,
amazing.
if, a few $1,000s for a, contract furniture, or, probably $10,000 for an Eames chair,
Hmm.
and it's, um, I it is like taken from, it takes a lot of inspiration from, all of our Altos, uh, chairs from the early 20th century. And some people would complain, I'm sure, that it's derivative of those
Hmm.
designs. But I think that the creativity there is like to create such a universal design. Apparently they sell over, 1 million of these chairs each year.
Yeah.
Um, it packs down into a tiny box, right? It's super durable. It's, I think it was developed in the 1970s. It's still, top seller. It still feels current,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's not the most impressive, chair to impress your like designer friends with, but it is like 97% of the way there at
Hmm.
like 1% of the cost.
Yeah.
And,
It's
in a way
amazing.
that is just remarkably universal. And the materials are very authentic to what
Hmm.
you're asking them to do. And I think like that is just very clever to me. Like
Yeah.
design, I think, is how do you combine all these different constraints? Like doing more with more, that's easy. Like doing more
Oh,
with
right, right, right.
less, that's really the
Yeah.
challenge, right?
Yeah.
And how to do that and then actually make that work at scale, of
Hmm.
mass manufacturing. How do you take craft, which is inherently kind of one of one, and then express that across, the most mass of mass manufacturing, which obviously Apple achieves too. There are over 1 billion iPhones, and yet they each feel like they have this element of craft in them, and I think that's, you know, those kind of designs I think are the most effective to me. And
Yeah.
yeah, so that's one design that
I love
I
that
think is
example.
an underrated but a
Yeah.
really quite impressive example of a really successful design.
Yeah. I mean, IKEA in general, that manages to do this, that particular chair. I also owned one of those. And I also admire them as a company. Like I studied architecture, so I've always been sensitive to creating a very kind of beautiful interior environment. But the price point of that beauty is prohibitive for most people, and I feel like IKEA makes a really beautiful, authentic, minimalist environment possible, you know, for everyone if that's what they're into. S- and to do that at the level of innovation, not just product wise, but business model wise, information design wise, packing wise, is radical. Super cool. Anything else come to
Yeah,
mind?
yeah, and I think too, like that whole, you know, uh, Scandinavian design and whatnot, and the sort of a lot of the highlights of German design, like they they came out of an era of sort of hard times,
Yeah.
and like the goal that many of those designers had was to make their customers just sort of like feel better,
Yeah.
at a time in the world that was really challenging. And, the simplicity, it's like understandable, it's minimal, it's optimistic at the end of the day. Right.
Yeah.
And I think like that, you know, the world goes through its, gyrations, but I think that's like always relevant, like how can design make you feel, you know, comforted and, human, and optimistic.
Yeah.
You know,
I love that.
yeah, I think that's one of the grand challenges.
I think it's really true. And it's easy to, like, when we talk about how design and engineering are coming together, that's not how a lot of people would talk about the role of engineering, right? Uh, but I agree with you that design often is playing this fundamental role. Um, creating a feeling of optimism, if not also other types of emotional comfort. It's cool. Any other, we're ready to kind of like shift into takeaways and stuff, but are there any other designs you want to share? Feel magical to you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there's so many different things. I think, one aspect of designs that I think is fascinating is that, the quote unquote, they don't make them like they used to. And I think like the role of cost reduction in industrial design leads to that being absolutely true. And I think a fun thing to do is do a teardown of the same product versus one, the same type of product from 30 or 40 years ago. And you realize that like, it is pretty genius the way they managed to reduce the cost and amount of material, in every aspect of the design. But yet, if you had to have only one of those, you'd probably rather have, the heritage one.
Yeah.
And I think that's, this sort of question of, for reasons of sustainability and economy and whatnot, like cost reduction is, of course, inevitable and it is a good thing, but also to go back to, some of these very successful designs from a long time ago, like I think about, some of my favorite designs are just everyday objects, like a nice kitchen knife, a nice kitchen knife, those designs were locked in many decades, in some cases over 100 years ago. They've basically not been significantly changed since. They work awesome. If you have, a knife from your parents or grandparents, it's probably as good or better than what you could buy today, because the long arch of, the wood was old growth and the metal came from Sweden at the height of their steel making. And, like these sort of geopolitical impacts on the products that we get to use. Now it's like, oh, the wood is the third growth and comes from a plantation, which, yeah, sure, that's sustainable, but it, as an object, like like I said, they don't make it like they used to, and so I think that's always interesting to kind of reflect on. And, in some product categories, of course, legacy products seem absurdly out of date, right? Fast moving technology, categories, they're a bit different, but in the sort of stuff of everyday life, I think it's, worth paying attention to some of those aesthetic, elements and like, how come that design, like, it just like, it basically didn't get changed from that point. Like, is it done? Is there some new kitchen knife that would be like way better, but nobody's like thought about it yet? Like, or is that like the end state of like, that is the end of the evolutionary tree, like it's done. Which I think is a pretty fascinating thought starter when you look at different designs.
Wow. I like want to have a visualization somehow of like the end of each design trajectory. Well, so we've talked about a lot of different ways just through the examples of who you are and what you've made and what you admire about other products that all, represent this intersection of design and engineering. And so, I don't know, from what I can see, it appears like these fields, even calling design a field, an engineering field, is not really quite appropriate. There are many fields within them, but it feels like they're increasingly kind of bleeding together. I wonder if you have any, observations on that and how better to educate for that intersection. And, feel free to couch that in terms of the types of people you're looking for, when you're hiring.
Yeah. I mean, one of the most exciting moments to me was when I learned that design engineer was actually a job description. And
Right.
that's what it's more commonly used in the UK than here in the
Uh-huh.
US. But um, that's what I had on my business card when I was at IDEO. And
Oh, cool.
you know,
So that
to
was like
me,
2013 or something? 20,
yeah, that was
when would
back in
that have
the
been?
20
Yeah.
2010s.
Yeah.
And to me, the design part there meant that you're the kind of engineer that starts with a blank sheet of paper, right?
Hmm.
A lot of engineers are focused on optimization. They're focused on statistical process control and many other important things, right? But the design part there to me meant you start with nothing and create something,
Yeah.
and which is a totally different skill set, frankly, than optimization. And
Hmm.
so yeah, I think I would say that the best way to learn is by doing, right? I think that's why project-based work is so important. And, you can learn some things by benchmarking and looking what people have done before you, but design is really more of a process, right? And so it's learning the steps of that process, how to generate ideas and go wide, and then how to thoughtfully, curate those and choose the way forward, how to prototype, how to take things far enough to learn what you want to learn, but not go too far down the rabbit hole that you end up sidetracked, and then of course, one of the challenging things is how do you get a finished product out the door, right? How do you,
Yeah.
like Steve Jobs said that, real artists ship. Um, and yeah, I think that's true. Obviously, when you're learning design, like you need to bring your projects to completion, essentially.
Yeah.
Um, and then kind of on to the next thing. Um, and yeah, I think now there's so much inspiration, there's so much input, right? I mean, there's go look for your favorite, hashtags on Instagram or TikTok or, wherever. And there's just so many designs out there. You realize how many creative people there are in the world, how many ideas have been tried and whatnot. But, I think like the design process is pretty personal, like you kind of need to do it for yourself. Like even if other people have, made some strides into it, um, you need to give it a shot, and then you'll have like a whole different understanding of,
Yeah.
the problem that you're trying to solve. And if you're going to be, build a career in design, right, you're going to need to get really comfortable with taking that blank sheet of paper and creating something that you believe in, and then sharing it with people around you who maybe you need to convince them, maybe you need to bring them along on the journey. That's where like design intersects business, right? How do you actually, shepherd your designs through the many, through the gauntlet of other considerations besides aesthetics, that apply their own filters on what actually, ends up out in the world. And
Yeah.
I would say that's sort of like the more advanced end of design, and figuring out, how to keep things true to their essence, right? I think that's
Hmm.
something that all designers know and are motivated by. And when you start looking at that in the business context, like you need supporters at all level of the organization to back
Yeah.
up the designers in that belief system. And companies that do that become phenomenally successful, and their
Yeah.
designs, are beautiful. And many other companies, don't experience that,
Hmm.
because they don't put design at the top or the center, depending on how you look at it, and they
Yeah.
they approach things other ways, which frankly may be okay for business. There's a lot of successful businesses that are not design led, um,
Hmm.
but frankly, I think they're a lot more boring than the ones that are.
Well, I think the challenge is if a competitor enters your space that is design led, and really listens to the experience of the people who you know use or consume this creation, expectations will change in many categories, even things that feel boring, like banking, right? If your competitor begins to provide a much better user experience, you're likely to have to learn to do this as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, design can always be a strong differentiator.
Yeah.
And then uh, I think there's the sort of quality of the design. And then, once you get farther down into a bigger competitive set, then that's where the aspect of taking a strong perspective, I think, becomes, even more important.
Yeah. Well, those are great takeaways for both, people looking to work at the intersection of these fields and for leaders who are trying to up their game in this intersection. I want to really thank you for joining me and sharing your background and sharing your own inspiration, and of course what you have built and given to the world is very inspiring to others, including me. So I just want to really thank you for joining me today. I hope you have a great day.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for Making It is brought to you by the MADE program at RISD and Brown University and your host, Professor Beth Altringer Eagle. Learn more at madecollaborative.org. And as always, thank you for making it.